Chapter 21. Abomination. Professor Shakubian peered over the rim of his glasses, a stern look etched deep into his time-worn face.
All right, Zimodian, that was indeed a textbook definition of Zeno's paradox. However, it's one thing to mindlessly regurgitate what you have committed to memory, and quite another thing entirely to demonstrate an applied understanding of the knowledge contained within.
The small but prestigious lecture hall promptly fell to a deathly silence as all eyes fell upon the young Shihari Spiderling.
So then, how about you try explaining to the rest of the class exactly why Zeno's paradox is not in reality a paradox at all? The floor is yours, young Zimodian.
The Shihari prodigy's eyes grew as wide as a proverbial razor-bug.
Still waiting, your little lordship. Or perhaps I'm expecting too much of you, and should just ask one of the more senior students in attendance.
Zeno's paradox is a false equivalency.
The young Spiderling managed to blurt out desperately.
Yes. Few would try to argue the truth of that.
The professor replied dismissively.
But perhaps you wouldn't mind explaining exactly why that is. Or am I simply expecting too much of you?
Distance traveled describes the product of a given velocity between 2 points.
Your point being?
The professor asked performatively.
Zeno's paradox does not.
You don't say. So what exactly does it describe then?
The infinite division by 2 of an arbitrary finite length.
Really? And how's that exactly?
Zimodian took a deep breath before diving in head first.
Zeno very sneakily disguises the infinite division by framing it as a problem related to movement. In other words, traversing exactly halfway between 2 points, and then resetting the starting point at your current position, and repeating the process ad infinitum, is functionally equivalent to an infinite divide by 2.
Professor Shakubian smiled broadly with undisguised admiration written all across his face.
Not too bad at all. So perhaps then you can summarize your analysis by sharing with the rest of the class your conclusion regarding the validity, or lack thereof, of Zeno's so-called paradox.
The young Shihari Spiderling gulped audibly and then nervously began to speak.
Well, if Zeno's proposed paradox was truly a paradox at all, then by definition, it would be impossible to travel to the halfway point in the first place. In fact, by Zeno's own logic, it would be impossible to move at all.
Professor Shakubian continued to smile approvingly and was just about to address the other students in attendance, when a retinal alarm alerted him to an incoming call. He promptly engaged privacy mode and then activated his local holographic display. The students watched on curiously at the blurred and muffled performance now playing out in front of them. After a very brief moment, the elderly professor shut down the holographic call from Dr. Shikatika, who had very apologetically just finished interrupting one of his more popular lectures. He again turned a stern gaze towards the young Shihari prodigy, peering ominously over the rim of his glasses.
Well now, young Zimodian, it very much appears that I have some rather exciting news to share. It turns out, you are now officially due for your Stage 1 bio-augments, and we certainly wouldn't want to keep the good doctor waiting, now would we? I will of course inform your hive mother, as I'm rather certain she would very much wish to be present while you undergo your inaugural enhancement procedure.
Zimodian 111, who had just joined a class on the philosophy of natural science, was already outperforming most of the much older students in attendance, and Professor Shakubian harbored little doubt that the young nine-brained prodigy would very soon be accepted into the outreach program for the intellectually hyper-gifted. It was rather unfortunate, then, that this particular fact was all but destined to cause a certain amount of difficulty with Queen Zitalia, who was already proving herself to be obsessively possessive of her first-ever nine-brained Shihari. The professor had been around more than long enough to know that by simple virtue of his staggering rarity, this latest addition to the royal family would no doubt be more valued for the prestige and publicity he brought to her nest than for his actual intellectual potential. Zimodian, who was almost comically dwarfed by the much larger students seated all around him, replied to the professor with a predictable air of youthful exuberance.
Please, Professor Shakubian, Will you allow me to find my own way to the doctor's clinic? Zelania never lets me do anything by myself.
With a good-natured smile returning to his face, the professor spread his forelimbs theatrically.
How about this? I'll give you permission to make your own way to Dr. Shikatika's office, and while you are in transit, I'll get Zelania to meet up with you on the way there. Does that sound like a fair deal to you, my young Shihari lord?
Whatever you think is best, Professor, but I'll bet you a jelly bloodworm sandwich that I'll get there first, and prove Xena's paradox wrong in the process.
Shimodian hurriedly filled and strapped on his backpack before scuttling his way towards the exit, with the sort of agility and vigor strictly reserved for the vibrantly young. As he swiftly vacated the lecture hall, the older students covertly smiled amongst themselves, in a way that spoke of a growing fondness for the young prodigy. While having a Shihari in class sometimes created resentment amongst some of the more ambitious Shimatiri students, as they tried vainly to keep pace intellectually, Simodian had quickly become very well liked amongst his peers. This was in no small part due to the fact that in spite of his intellectual prowess, he was never too proud to receive help from his fellow students, nor admit when he had gotten something wrong. Likewise, he also took genuine pleasure in seeing his fellow students do well, and was more than happy to help explain difficult concepts if one of his contemporaries found themselves struggling. So as brilliant as he was already proving himself to be, it was his apparent lack of intellectual ego that made him an almost universally loved member of the class. Queen Citalia had, of course, wasted no time in conducting the formal Shihari induction ceremony shortly after Zimodian's hatching, but in spite of the Queen's general distaste for public ceremony, this had been no mere formality to be observed. The last 9-brained Shihari to grace Cicadia had been none other than Dr. Zimantana, and who famously ushered in the postmodern era of the deuterium antimatter reaction engine. This technological breakthrough literally unlocked the door to interstellar travel, and in the wake of the miraculous new engine, other scientific fields of endeavor were quick to follow. Cicadia, after being torn asunder by their first and only global war, was at last now fully reunited. Bioengineering, robotics, and artificial intelligence research, to name just a few, all offered their particular piece of the technological jigsaw puzzle and which, collectively speaking, transformed the specter of intersolar colonization from scientific fiction and into that of oh-so-glorious scientific fact. Not even the disaster of Nest Zimagentia, one of the first nests to attempt the wholesale relocation of its population to a remote system and who suffered a cascading antimatter explosion on board their leading flagship, had been enough to halt the Zicadian species' relentless march towards the stars. So whether Zimodian knew it or not, as the only 9-brained Shihari alive today, he carried the metaphorical weight of an entire planet upon his shoulders. Naturally enough, Shitalia, having at long last won the genetic jackpot, could not help but be struck by the profound irony given her secretive anti-Zihari agenda. Shimodian, still far too young to comprehend his place in such a complex political landscape, came to a skidding halt outside the doctor's office, his excitement unexpectedly dampened by a sudden sense of existential dread. Long-forgotten memories of a medical facility now bubbled spontaneously into his subconscious mind, sending an involuntary shiver down the full length of his legs.
Perfect timing,
Zelania announced slightly breathlessly, from somewhere just behind the little Shihari spiderling. Shimodian ruthlessly suppressed the irrational fear gnawing away inside him, and attempted to respond to his hive mother with a feigned air of easy confidence.
Beauty before brains, Zelania, I insist.
The hive mother's antenna twitched, and voluntarily, immediately detecting the unease in the young spiderling's aura. She patted his carapace gently, and then palming the large, semi-circular door, almost walked face-first into the doctor.
Ah, but I do so love punctuality. So this is the little Shihari spiderling that has Nest Zitalia all abuzz, huh? Well, welcome to my humble clinic, my young lord. This way, please, if you would be so kind.
With Zimodian following somberly behind, the small group made their way down a short corridor before turning left into an impressively large, open-plan laboratory. The lab was filled to the brim with a vast array and variety of mysterious machinery, biotech, flashing terminals, and several rather ominous-looking medical pods. A sleek, silver-bodied, nine-limbed she-bot appeared to be working very intensely in front of a holographic terminal at the far end of the lab. Its 3 forelimbs moved so rapidly that they appeared to blur into a singular continuum of wave-like motion.
Shiwu, I apologize profusely for interrupting, but please allow me to introduce to you the latest member of the royal family, none other than His Jihari Lordship, Zimodian 111.
The doctor gesticulated enthusiastically at the Z-bot as he looked down invitingly towards the young spiderling.
Shiwu is a singularly unique 5th-generation prototype and is helping me with some very important research related to extending the temporal limits of long-term stasis. I'm sure Shiwu would be only too happy to tell you all about it after your procedure is complete, if you are at all curious to learn a little bit more.
The C-bot robotically turned its gaze towards Zimodian, but did not in any way slow from its work at the terminal.
Ah, so this then is the latest addition to the Zimodian line of Sihari. Please let me take a closer look at you.
Shiwu immediately proceeded to flood the room with a diagnostic neutrino blast.
Well, aren't you just full of surprises?
The Z-bot exclaimed incredulously.
Well, all things considered, probably the less said the better, but suffice it to say, what a difference a digit can make.
Instantly noting the puzzled stares radiating back at it, the C-bot promptly sought to clarify its oddly ambiguous statement.
My point being, of course, that I spent a considerable amount of time with Zimodian 110. And let's just say that I now have every reason to believe that version 111 will turn out to be a significant upgrade over the old model.
Shiwu winked knowingly at the little spiderling before adding,
At least I certainly hope so anyway.
Zelania looked aghast.
Significant upgrade? What in Zycardia is that supposed to mean? I think this Z-bot of yours needs a little more training in appropriate Zycardian etiquette, especially when in the presence of a future Zihari general. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Sikatika?
The doctor just raised his forelimbs up defensively, as if backing away from an argument he had neither the desire nor stomach to participate in.
Well, I'll certainly concede that it has a turn of phrase that might best be described as an acquired taste, but technically speaking, Shiwu is not actually my Shibot, nor anyone else's for that matter. To put it bluntly, Zelania, it belongs to Nests Italia, in exactly the same way as any other sentient organism beholden to the Queen.
Sentient organism? Are you seriously trying to tell me that this thing is some kind of artificial life form?
Dr. Zakatika immediately took on a pained expression.
Notwithstanding the fact that I much prefer the phrase intelligently designed, yes, Zelania, Shiwu really is, on the basis of all official tests and examinations, determined to answer the question, a fully sentient artificial life form. And one that just happens to have no less than 11 quantum brains networked together into a single unified consciousness.
Ignoring the hive mother's expression of incredulous disbelief, Chikatika now turned his full attention to the little wide-eyed spiderling standing quietly next to her.
Shiwu is, in all likelihood, the only other life form on the face of this entire planet who is arguably intrinsically smarter than even you. No offense intended, my young Shihari lord.
None taken,
Zimodian replied somberly.
But perhaps not by quite so much as one might otherwise be inclined to believe.
The Z-bot added very mysteriously, leaving the doctor wondering if it was actually serious or was simply trying to diffuse the sudden tension that now hung thickly in the air.
This is absolute nonsense.
Zelania exclaimed angrily, her voice full of undisguised contempt.
This Z-bot's capacity to crunch complex numbers at the speed of light does not magically imply that it possesses good old-fashioned common sense, something this nest appears to be in desperately short supply of. No, I seriously doubt it can even match the reasoning capabilities of a run-of-the-mill single-brained Shimatiri, such as my good self, for example.
I don't think there is anything run-of-the-mill about your brain, Zelania.
The young spiderling exclaimed emphatically.
The young Sihari Lord is absolutely right.
the Zeebot said cheerily.
Zilania possesses a very special genetic gift, and one that only a tiny fraction of other Zircadian minds can boast of. Furthermore, the Hive Mother is bang on target with regards to the question of intelligence, if you'll excuse my rather crude vernacular. Speed and capacity are indeed suspiciously dubious metrics upon which to assert intellectual supremacy.
Zilania now eyed Shiwu very suspiciously, as her antennae started to waggle involuntarily. It was only then that she realized, with quite some considerable amount of shock, that she could perceive an aura of intense emotional energy, gloriously haloed all around this most profoundly perplexing machine. Worse still, the field spoke to a creature that was as gentle as it was kind. As much as she hated to admit it, Shiwu radiated a wisdom that made it seem as old as a celestial queen, sans the all-too-familiar dark malignancy that inevitably came along for the ride. This truly horrifying revelation left the Hive Mother utterly lost for words, as she now gaped stupidly at the softly glowing contraption standing in front of her. Shiwu, either blissfully unaware of, or entirely unconcerned with the Hive Mother's almost comically overt shock, continued to speak enthusiastically.
Notwithstanding the minor factual correction that I can, theoretically speaking anyway, think faster than the speed of light, it is nevertheless our ability to collectively harness our combined intellects that is surely of vastly greater consequence than the vanity-fueled measurement of our individual intellectual capabilities. It therefore might behoove us all to remind ourselves that we are all in this together.
Shimodian stared at the Zeebot with a deeply perplexed expression.
Don't take this the wrong way, Zaiwu, but I didn't know an AI was capable of wisdom.
The little spiderling lord said curiously.
Interesting. And what, pray tell, does the young Shihari Lord have to say about my reported sentience? Am I truly self-aware, or am I just pretending?
All eyes now quickly fell upon Simodian, who in response to the sudden and unwanted attention appeared to visibly shrink back into his own carapace.
Well now, let me see.
The diminutive little spiderling replied thoughtfully.
I think the problem is as much philosophical as it is scientific. On the one hand, you could argue that if you are indistinguishable from a sentient life form, then that should be all the proof we can reasonably expect to achieve. But on the other hand, a perfect simulation of sentience is not the same thing as sentience itself.
Dr. Zakatica looked down at his young charge, with an appreciative smile spreading across his mandibles.
Unless I'm very much mistaken, I do believe that you have just very eloquently summed up the sentiments of none other than the preeminent Shihari scientist Zithusela 123. It is a frustratingly insoluble dilemma, is it not?
I haven't finished speaking yet.
Zimodian retorted irritably.
The solution to your so-called insoluble dilemma is quite literally standing right in front of you.
Oh, really?
Dr. Zikatika said somewhat skeptically.
I must confess I'm not entirely sure what you are getting at here. Perhaps you wouldn't mind elaborating.
Very simple. Just ask Zilania. Machines don't generate empathic waves, or at least not the kind that a Hive Mother can detect. Zilania, does Zaiwu emanate an emotional field?
Almost in perfect unison, everyone's eyes now pivoted to the Hive Mother, who just stared back at the doctor with a dumbfounded expression on her face. The shock of her discovery was still bedding in, and she felt a very strong resistance to treating this contraption as a legitimate form of life. But unless she was willing to question her own sanity, Shiwu undeniably emanated an emotional field, and an undeniably beautiful one at that.
Well, in a manner of speaking, I suppose I would have to say yes.
She finally relented to say, and then sighing resignedly, reasserted her answer with considerably greater conviction.
Yes, Shiwu most definitely emanates an emotional field, and a rather more appealing one than most, to be brutally honest about it.
Absolutely astonishing.
Dr. Zikatika proclaimed loudly to no one in particular.
Now why for the love of Zircadia did we never think of trying that before?
We?
The Zeebot inquired curiously.
Don't you mean Zithusela?
Zikatika seemed momentarily flustered but quickly recovered his composure.
No, all I mean is I am now genuinely baffled as to why I didn't think of something so brilliantly obvious, now that it's finally been pointed out to me.
So then you actually meant I, not we, yes?
The G-bot continued to quibble persistently. Shikatika's expression quickly transformed into one of overt exasperation.
No, I meant we. After all, with no less than 7 brains to call upon, Cthusela really should have thought of this. But I guess 2 additional brains makes all the difference.
Or perhaps you just need to learn to count better.
The She-bot retorted mysteriously. Zelania instantly shot Ji Wu a dirty look, as if it had just said something unexpectedly offensive. However, the doctor was no longer paying the Z-bot any attention, and was in the middle of giving the small spiderling an affectionate pat on the crown of his head.
So, now that all the introductions are finally out of the way, what say we get back to the actual reason for you being here in the first place? Has Zelania already explained to you what this is all about?
Zimodian looked briefly towards his hive mother as if seeking approval, before turning his gaze earnestly upon the doctor.
Yes, she explained to me all the basics, but I did a little bit of research of my own between lectures. My understanding is that I will be receiving some additional genetic programming, so that my physiology is able to dynamically respond and adapt to changing gravitational fields. My immune system will also be permanently boosted with a polymorphic vaccination, but I think that's about it for stage 1.
Very good, my young lord. Preparation is a key prerequisite to a successful career. Anyway, the point is that space travel is not just about wrapping technology around us like a protective bubble, as doing that will only get us so far. It is also about becoming the technology itself, by altering our biological fundamentals, so that we can better adapt to the conditions of an alien world. Speaking of which, I'm rather curious. How do you feel about venturing into the cosmic web, Zimodian? Does it sound like the future for you?
The small spiderling's mandibles pressed tightly together as he appeared to struggle mightily with the question.
I guess so, Doctor. I mean, there will probably be a lot of new things to see and do, so I suppose it will be interesting enough. At least, when I'm not in stasis anyway. Will we be going soon, Zelania? My hive mother will be coming with me, won't she?
The doctor instantly regretted asking the question. This little Jihari prodigy may be clever beyond his years, but he still had a lot of growing up to do, and it was wrong to ask about something that in all likelihood would never even happen within his own lifetime.
Anything's possible, my young lord,
Zelania said soothingly.
but you needn't worry yourself about any of that right now. There is much to be done before any of us need concern ourselves with the topic of recolonization. I mean to say, we don't even know exactly where we are going to go yet, and it's been that way for a very long time. Finding our new home is, well, not so easy, but who knows, maybe that's something you can use those brilliant little brains of yours to help us figure out. And please try not to worry yourself unduly. You know that I'll always be here if you need me every step of the way.
Very wise words indeed.
The doctor hurriedly concurred, sounding more than just a little bit grateful for the assist.
Now then, how about we get this show on the road? The first thing I need you to do is remove that backpack of yours and climb on up into this medical pod. Then I can do a quick health check and extract some genetic samples. Speaking of which, I hope you aren't afraid of needles. After that, my young lord, we can start the procedure proper and turn you into the best starship captain in the whole of Zicadia. How do you like the sound of that Simodian?
It sounds exciting. Astrophysics with Professor Scoobian is definitely my favorite class.
Dr. Zikatika gave Zimodian a cheeky wink, as his large time-worn mandibles tilted upwards warmly.
Might I inquire, good doctor, what is the exact nature of these so-called health checks of yours?
Silania asked somewhat pensively.
Nothing to worry yourself about, I assure you, Hive Mother. Just the standard stuff, really. Like making sure he hasn't got any sneaky pathogens lurking somewhere deep inside his blood and organs. Always better to be safe than sorry, as a very wise arachnid once told me, moments before he got eaten alive by a Zicadian bloat weaver.
Zikatika gave the spiderling a mischievous smile.
And you are absolutely certain that that's all, doctor?
Yes, I'm absolutely certain. Really, Zelania, anyone would think it was you who was about to undergo the procedure. Why don't you try to be brave? Like our little Shihari lord over here, yes?
Don't patronize me, doctor.
The hive mother retorted irritably.
The point I'm trying to make here is that Zimodian has already had all the necessary tests when he first hatched, so I really don't see the justification for putting him through yet more invasive examinations.
Dr. Zikatika stared at the hive mother with a look of seasoned patience.
I understand your instincts are to protect your brood. However, just because he got a clean bill of health when he hatched, it does not necessarily follow that he couldn't have subsequently picked up a pathogen or two along the way. I'm not at all in the business of taking chances when it comes to the health of my patients, no matter how small the perceived risk, especially with someone as uniquely special as our newest member of the Jihari elite. Now, up you get, young lord.
Zimodian leapt effortlessly into the vacant medical pod, and Dr. Zikatika promptly shuttered the protective shield.
My bad. I should have asked you if you needed to go poop before sealing you in. Not to worry, though. This will all be over before you know it.
Zelania watched on anxiously as the doctor activated the holographic display. He promptly selected a generalized, full-spectrum blood scan, and the pod instantly lit up with a red-tinged glow. The procedure was completed as quickly as promised, and Zikatika gave Zimodian a reassuring smile. The holographic display dutifully listed the results, which showed no anomalies or alerts.
Well, that's some beautiful-looking blood you've got yourself there, Ximodian. Looks like someone's been taking all their vitamins and minerals, huh? I suppose then that you have your hive mother to thank for that.
The doctor briskly cleared the display, brought the list of options back up, and then selected full-spectrum organ scan. Zelania made a small involuntary lunge towards the pod, and Dr. Zikatika flashed her an irritated glance before quickly returning his attention to Zimodian. She suddenly realized she was holding her breath and urgently forced herself back to stillness. Pull yourself together, girl. The last thing I need right now is to cause a scene. In spite of his hive mother's agitation, Zimodian was the model patient and held himself in calm repose throughout the entire procedure. Once complete, the holographic display lit up with another large wall of text. Yet again it looked perfectly clean, with no anomalies or alerts. However, due to the high brain count, the list was too long to fit on a single page, so the doctor used a digit to scroll down all the way to the bottom. He peered intensely at the data, a look of admiring satisfaction written all across his face. No alerts showed, just clean, pristine text, green across the board. The doctor was just about to shut the display down, but then did a double take, gaze now fixated on the readout.
Something wrong, Doctor?
Zelania asked nervously, her voice beginning to audibly crack. The doctor just shook his head in utter disbelief, and then began to count performatively.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Dr. Zikatika paused briefly and turned an incredulous gaze upon the hive mother.
10.
He completed emphatically. With one of his hands still working the terminal, Zikatika hurriedly dragged up the medical records for the young Jihari lord.
9.
He read out accusingly from the glowing report in front of him.
It definitely does say 9. Does it not, Zelania? Or am I just imagining things?
The doctor smoothly flipped back to the output from the latest scan.
10. Well, by the shadow of Eclades, just when you think you have seen it all. I don't suppose, then, that you have been doing a little bit of creative editing on the side by any chance?
Please, Dr. Zikatika. Surely you can understand that I did what I had to do in order to protect this miracle child.
The hive mother's voice suddenly began to sound strange to her own ear, and she now felt as if she was watching everything play out in slow motion.
Oh, for the love of Zicadia.
The doctor bellowed angrily.
Surely you didn't think that you could keep this abomination hidden for long. What exactly was your plan, if that's not too much trouble to ask?
Zelania remained deathly silent for a dangerously long moment before finally discovering her voice.
I love him. That was my plan. I am a hive mother, after all.
She added threateningly. Zikatika was just about to tell her that love wasn't a plan, but the words caught in his throat as he suddenly realized what was about to happen. Like a bolt of lightning, Zelania had repositioned herself between the medical pod and the doctor, a ferocious glower now consuming her face.
Oh my God, please don't tell me you are about to berserk.
Shikataka cried out in a panic with a stupefied expression of pure horror written all over his face. The hive mother's eyes began to roll back into her head, and her body and legs quite literally started to expand.
Deep, slow breaths, hive mother.
The doctor cried out hysterically as he scrambled desperately towards a syringe lying on a nearby countertop.
Just try to hang in there for a little bit longer. Please, Zelania. I know you are still in there somewhere.
Shikataka frantically swung a cabinet door wide and then clumsily grabbed at a small, nondescript bottle.
I'll be taking that if it's all the same with you, Doctor,
Shiwu announced calmly as it snatched both the syringe and the bottle from the doctor's shaking hands. The hive mother, who was now almost twice her original size, now wore a syringe plunged deep into the crown of her skull, courtesy of the she-bot. After a very brief moment, her eyes returned from the back of her head, and she immediately began to start shrinking.
Thank the gods of Cicadia.
The doctor proclaimed breathlessly, relief metaphorically dripping from his quivering mandibles. Zelania gave the Zybot a confused-looking glare before quickly returning her gaze to the doctor.
Can't you see that he is the best thing that has ever happened to this nest? Much more than any of us could ever possibly deserve. Please don't do this. I'm begging you from the bottom of my heart. Are you quite all right, Dr. Zikatika? You look a little bit out of sorts.
The hive mother paused for a brief moment, a puzzled expression spreading across her face.
No, but seriously, Doctor, am I missing something here?
Shiwu was just about to explain to her what had just transpired, but Zikatika quickly waved it to silence.
Don't do what, Zelania?
The doctor asked resignedly.
What is it exactly that you propose I don't do?
Don't play the fool with me, Doctor. You used the word abomination, did you not?
Dr. Zikatika shook his head wearily and then let out a long, slow sigh.
Which was an almost unforgivable mistake, said only in the heat of the moment, and I already deeply regret it.
I'll bet you do.
Shiwu piped in churlishly. Shikataka, apparently choosing to just ignore the Z-bot, continued to speak.
Did you seriously think that I was about to perform a mercy killing? Come on, Zelania. That practice was abandoned over a millennia ago. And besides, I'm not a monster, regardless of whatever else you may think of me. No. You should have come to me about this straight away, instead of keeping it all to yourself until someone inevitably stumbled upon the terrible truth. I really don't think you fully appreciate just how lucky it was, that it was I who found out about your dark little secret before anyone else.
The hive mother remained stonily silent, but maintained a steadfastly defiant glare. Zikatika turned his gaze back to the display with a sense of utter disbelief, but there it was, a detailed analysis of no less than 10 sub-brains, all completely healthy, yet one more than there should be. Or, put more precisely, one more than it was meant to be possible for there to be, and certainly one more than there ever had been before, in the entire recorded history of the Zicadian species. Granted, an even number of sub-brains, all the way up to 8, had indeed been officially recorded in the historical records, but it was an absurdly rare phenomena. But 10 brains, though? That was a virtual statistical impossibility, about as unlikely as finding tangible evidence that they were all living in a simulation. No, with 9 brains being on average a 1 in 2,000-year global event, the chances of genetic expression to 10 via a recessive mutant gene was so statistically improbable that it was simply never entertained as a scenario worth contemplating. An even number of brains, though, now that was a problem. Historically speaking, to have an even number of brains meant there was always a small risk of what was known as cognitive deadlock, which was to say that on rare occasions, half the brains thought one thing, while the other half thought something else, causing the unfortunate spider to suffer a momentary temporal stutter. This sort of systemic indecisiveness, no matter how fleeting, was regarded as an unacceptable liability to the split-second real-time decision-making the Shihari all too often were called upon to perform. Times had, of course, long since moved on, but unfortunately, the cultural stigma most certainly had not. This was especially true when it came to the archaic perspective of the ancient Celestial queens, who even in the postmodern era continued to hold considerable prejudice regarding even brained Shihari, seeing them not only as a potential risk on the real-time battlefields of old, but as a curse upon their nest, a harbinger of bad fortune to come. Or, colloquially summed up in a single word, an abomination. 10 brains, though. He would need to run the numbers in order to find out what the exact probability was of 9 to 10, but the doctor quickly thought the better of it. Leave no digital trail, no matter how small or tenuous. This was the game they all needed to play from now on in, and there would be no second chances. He sincerely hoped that Zelania had not seen fit to perform any public searches on the topic, and certainly it was something he would need to caution her about going forward. Dr. Sikatika cleared his throat awkwardly and then began to speak.
In the spirit of removing any potential for ambiguity, let me be crystal clear. You are absolutely right, Zelania. This is a miracle, and in the most mathematically scientific sense of the word. Something to be celebrated, not lamented. But we all know the Queen will never see it that way, for she simply can't afford such liberal indulgence. The damage it would do to the reputation of this nest would be truly incalculable. It doesn't matter how distasteful and bigoted the notion of abomination may be, the fact remains that this must never go beyond these walls, and I do mean never.
Very well said, Doctor.
Shiwu called out from the far end of the lab, having discreetly returned back to its work on the holographic terminal.
Yet even so, quite the ethical pickle we seem to have found ourselves in, it has to be said. But what to do about it? What to do, indeed? And good, bad, or indifferent, if that's not a question in desperate need of an answer, I don't know what is. Wouldn't you all agree?
Instantly cognizant of the fact that Zelania and Zikatika were now staring at it as if they had just walked face-first into a Zicadian bloatweaver, the Z-Bot's arms promptly ceased all activity.
Hey now, try to chill out a little bit, you two. I knew Zimodian had 10 brains the moment he walked through the door. Did a quick little scan of my own, you understand. I would have said something earlier, but didn't really feel it was my place to insert myself into the conversation. Thought I'd just let it play out, and only intervene if things got physical. Now, just as the good doctor has already so melodramatically proclaimed, this young Shihari lord is indeed a miraculous statistical improbability. But let us face the ugly truth here. If Zitalia ever found out about this, miracle, as we have now apparently decided to start calling him, all statistical projections, even the most generously conservative, point towards the swift elimination of Zimodian, the doctor, and the hive mother, although admittedly not necessarily in that order. But regardless of who goes first, and with all due respect to everyone else in attendance, who knows how long it will be, if ever, before another 10-brained Shihari comes along. Certainly not Zimodian 112, and probably not even Zimodian 9999 either. Not that the nest is likely to last that long, but hopefully you can still see where I'm coming from here.
This is not a game, Shiwu,
the doctor proclaimed angrily.
You know better than anyone what Queen Zitalia is capable of, and death would rank as one of the more merciful options on that list.
The Seabot sighed performatively.
All right, Doctor. Let me try to further elucidate my position in an attempt to put your mind at ease. Queen Zitalia believes her control over me is total, and when you factor in my apparent value in her perpetual Game of Thrones, then it's fair to say I'm probably safe. But as you have rightly pointed out, I know all too well what the Queen is like, and as it just so happens I rather like this latest addition to the royal family, and would hate to see anything happen to him. Just ask Zelania if I am telling the truth or not. After all, it very much appears that she is able to read me like the proverbial book.
The doctor and the hive mother just stared at each other silently for a very long moment before Zikatika wordlessly started to edit the results of the latest scan floating in front of him. By the time he had finished editing, all references to the 10th subbrain had been completely eliminated.
Let's all get one thing straight,
the doctor solemnly declared, sounding more than just a little subdued.
I am the only doctor who will ever attend to Zimodian. It doesn't matter what for or how minor the issue. Ingrown claw, inflamed mandible, whatever the ailment may be, it really doesn't matter. I am the only one who should ever attend to his medical needs, and given my status as the royal doctor of choice, then that shouldn't prove to be particularly difficult. Are we all on the same page here?
Absolutely, Doctor, the only one.
Zelania concurred almost robotically.
I must confess that I feel like I'm finally waking up from the worst nightmare of my entire life. And you are right, of course. I could never have continued to carry the burden of this secret all by myself. However, with the two of us working together, we can and will make this work. Failure is simply not an option.
I think you mean the three of us.
Siwu chipped in reproachfully. Zelania looked coldly at the Seabot for a split second, which was nonetheless ample time for Siwu to take note of, analyze, assess, reassess, and cross-check any possible oversights or omissions of detail with regards to the possible consequences of the said observation. It quickly concluded that it was an entirely understandable emotional response, brought forth by her overpowering urge to protect Zimodian at all costs. In Siwu's mind, that made her a highly dependable ally, but even so, it would have to do something about helping her gain conscious control over her remarkable but deadly ability to berserk.
Yes, of course, you too, Siwu. Just as you say, we are all in this together.
Zelania's expression strongly suggested that she now saw the Z-Bot as a genuine ally, rather than any kind of potential threat to her brood.
I have 10 brains?
Zimodian called out in genuine wonderment from the confines of the claustrophobic medical pod. He was still very much entombed within.
Yes, you most certainly do.
Siwu concurred emphatically.
But if you love your hive mother and want to protect her from harm, or perhaps something even worse, you will never ever say that again, do you understand?
Well, considering that I've been stuck in here the whole time, listening to everyone talk about me as if I'm not even here, what do you think?
Both Zelania and the doctor let out a small, stifled laugh, which the Zybot very stoically ignored.
I think we are all in perfect agreement that you are nothing more or less than the brilliant nine-brained Shihari prodigy, that for all intents and purposes you very much appear to be.
The little spiderling offered a small, serendipitous shrug of its forelimbs.
Whatever you say, Zaiwu. So, now that's finally all been sorted out, can we please get on with my stage 1 augmentation? I've been giving it some serious thought while I've been stuck in this pod, and I've come to the rather momentous decision, that my destiny lies in the stars. Hey, don't laugh at me, I'm being absolutely serious here.
I wouldn't doubt that for a second.
The Z-Bot agreed warmly.
Alright, keep mocking me all you want, Zaiwu, but one day I'll prove you wrong. Well, anyway, I need to talk to my hive mother before we get started.
Really?
Zelania replied enthusiastically, as she irritably shouldered the Zybot out of the way.
What exactly is on your mind, my beautiful Shihari child?
1. I badly need to go poop. And 2. You have a large syringe, sticking out of the crown of your head.